This is my PowerPoint on Chrétien de Troyes, Yvain and Lancelot. I want to start off with some salient points about medieval romance, kind of a broad and brief outline. And I want to caution you that not all of the romances have all of these conventions or fit the same pattern. But a medieval romance is a story of knights and damsels, although it isn't romantic. Okay, it's not our conception of romantic. Romance, the word romance just simply means something that's a story in the common tongue, not Latin. But it's a story of knights and damsels, and the action starts at court, oftentimes during a feast or high festival. It features a single hero on a quest. He goes out on his quest. He goes usually into the forest, and the forest is some kind of, is figured as an other world, a place where strange things can happen. He goes out to meet some challenge or do some particular thing, and then he returns to court. And during his travels, he has what we call adventures, challenges on the way to his goal. Sometimes damsels are rescued. Sometimes the hero learns, changes, and sometimes he is tested. Sometimes he just demonstrates something about himself. This latter is the case in Lancelot. Lancelot just shows us something. He doesn't change. Joseph Campbell says that the romance hero brings a boon back when he comes back to court. I would say sometimes. In Sir Gawain and the Green Knight from the 14th century, Gawain brings a boon back in the form of knowledge. But in the 12th century romances, I guess you could say, well, Lancelot brings Guinevere back, but I'm not sure that that's a boon. But anyway, the hero does not die in a romance, and that's in contrast to the epic hero, which is there's no women, no love, it's just battles, and the hero dies. In the romance, courtly love is often an element, and that means there is some form of love, but it isn't romantic love as we think of it. I'm going to go into that later. And finally, when we talk about adventures that the knight protagonist has in his quest, it does mean a challenge, that he faces challenges, but adventure also comes from the Old French aventure, which means chance or by chance. So what it appears to be is that the knight goes out and has all these random encounters, these things that happen by chance. In actuality, of course, the romance writer engineers those chance events because he has something to say through them. In terms of the plot trajectory, the protagonist goes out and back from the court. Goes out from the court and comes back. So you could describe his movement as circular, which is on the left. He begins and ends at the court. This circle thing is the image that Joseph Campbell uses when he talks about the voyage of the hero. But you could also describe it as with the two arrows going out and coming back. So physically, and in terms of the plot, he begins and ends at the court. But in terms of his development or change, the arrow goes one way. So he doesn't, that's just a way of indicating that the protagonist changes or develops. So the illustration I use for that is the circle with the arrow through it. But again, that doesn't apply to all romances. Not all knightly heroes change. And another element of romance is that the protagonist and the readers think that he's going to a particular place to achieve a goal. But he finds out, or we find out that he doesn't get directly to his goal. He doesn't start at A and end up at Z, his goal. Most of the story and most of the quest is taken up with individual adventures or encounters he has on the way to his goal. And oftentimes he grows and changes as a result of those adventures. That's the case with Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. It's the case with Percival, Chrétien's Percival. Or else we learn things about him through the course of the encounters or adventures. And I think that would be the case with Lancelot. Yvain is a little bit different. He changes, but it's like radical, rapid, before and after change, not a development. So this is the way I draw the idea of the goal versus the adventures. On the right, there's a little X. Our hero thinks he's going here. He's going to achieve this. This is his goal. But on the left, he ends up on a route that's more a squiggly line. And as I said, he spends his time with those adventures. Now, Yvain does not follow the romance's typical intrusion, challenge, and quest pattern. Instead, it starts just with Calogrenant, Yvain's cousin, telling him a story where he's shamed. And this happened 7 years ago. So there's no immediate challenge. Yvain does embark on a quest in that he leaves to find a specific adventure. But does he set out to right a wrong? Does he set out to rescue someone? No. And he doesn't have tests or trials on his way to his goal. His goal is to find the marvelous spring and avenge Calogrenant's shame, because Calogrenant was beaten by the Knight of the Spring. He simply runs into characters. He encounters a Vavasseur, which is lower nobility, and he encounters a Beastman. And we know that one reason the quest takes place outside the court, and usually in a forest, is so that the landscape and or encounters can be symbolic, usually of something about the protagonist and the values the romance promotes, or the romance writer is promoting. So Yvain's encounters with the Vavasseur and the Beastman suggest something about Yvain and his quest. Oftentimes, the medieval romance writer endows the protagonist with a foil or two. So my question is, what is a foil, and who might be the foil or foils in Yvain? A foil is a character that has characteristics that oppose another character. Usually the protagonist. The foil is not the protagonist. The foil character may be completely opposite or very similar to the protagonist with one or more key differences. It's also usually the case that the foil finds himself in the same or similar situations as the protagonist, and the foil acts or reacts differently or wins or loses. And that's a contrast to the protagonist. The foils in Yvain are first Calogrenant. He's a loser. He goes out to fight the Knight of the Spring, and he's defeated. The other interesting foil in Yvain is Yvain himself. Pre-mad Yvain is a foil. Now I want to say that the other way around. Post-mad Yvain is a foil for pre-mad Yvain. Yvain versus Yvain. What does Chrétien suggest through using Yvain as a foil for himself? Well, pre-madness Yvain is a skilled fighter, but Chrétien shows by contrasting pre-madness Yvain with post-madness Yvain, and also through some hints, he shows that Yvain's values and goals are selfish, superficial, and wrong-headed. He starts out to avenge his cousin's shame. He's looking for fame. He falls in love, and it's all about sex. And he goes on this adventure at the magic spring, knowing that it's a source of destruction. That's basically what it does. He gets to see this marvel afterwards, but the storm that he creates, the storm that Calogrenant created, was very destructive. Pre-madness Yvain, I'm going to skip to the third one, is disloyal to Arthur and to his own wife. Pre-madness Yvain sneaks out to have that adventure and avenge his cousin, because he's heard Arthur say that he's going to take the whole court there. And Yvain knows that if the whole court goes, Kay will get to have the challenge rather than Yvain. So Yvain has to sneak out. And that's just not done. You have to ask permission. In all the other romances, you get permission, and Arthur gets to choose who goes. And as you'll see, Yvain, you won't see that because you're not reading the romance, but Yvain also ends up being disloyal to his own wife. He falls in love with the wife of the Knight of the Spring, whom he's killed, and marries her, and then he says, can I go on quests with Gawain? And she says yes for a year and a day. And he doesn't come back. He doesn't come back in his year and a day. He forgets. So he's disloyal, and he doesn't keep his word to her. Post-madness Yvain is truly noble, and that's indicated in part by the lion. Yvain is cured by a hermit who gives him bread, and Yvain has gone crazy once he's gone mad. Once he's been called out for not going home in time. He's run off into the woods and torn off all his clothes and eats raw meat. So one of the things that happens to move him out of his madness is that a hermit puts bread out for him. And so that's Yvain's first taste of something from civilization. Yvain takes the hermit some raw meat for the hermit to cook, and there's a reciprocal relationship set up, which is important. And then a damsel goes against what she's told and smears Yvain all over with a magic ointment. She's told to not use too much. The ointment is from Morgan. She's told to just put some on his temples, but the damsel is extremely liberal and generous and smears him all over. So after he's cured, or no longer mad, he first rescues a lion from a serpent. And the symbolism here is obvious. The serpent is evil. The lion is the noble beast. And he becomes known as Le Chevalier au Lion, the Knight of the Lion, which shows the lion is a projection of that aspect of himself and shows that he's noble. But the lion is more than that. The lion is humble and thankful and loyal to Yvain. And Yvain gradually becomes, or immediately becomes, these things. And in his post-mad adventures, he's loyal, he keeps his word, and he is generous. And he fights for the right reasons. He rescues damsels, and he rights wrongs, and he saves villages. So one of his first adventures after he rescues the lion is to save a village from Count Allier, who's going in with his knights and burning everything. And that is a taste of medieval real life. That's how they fought. They would go in and burn somebody else's land and kill the peasants, and then set up a siege warfare, a siege of the castle. But the peasants took the brunt of the fighting. And Yvain also rescues a damsel from a giant who's going to kidnap her and rape her. And that's another taste of medieval real life. And he rescues some damsels that have been imprisoned and forced to weave silk. And yet another little aspect of medieval life for some women. So he fights for the right reasons. And Chrétien makes sure that Yvain's post-madness adventures are noble ones. I mean, the things he encounters give him a chance to act nobly, to rescue, and to right wrongs. Chrétien also uses conventions from the art of courtly love. And so I want to talk about that. It's the title in Old French is De Arte Honeste Amandi, which I'm probably mispronouncing, but later on it becomes translated as the art of courtly love. So Andreas begins by asking us, what is love? And it's an inborn suffering, proceeding from the sight and immoderate thought upon the beauty of the other sex, for which cause above all other things one wishes to embrace the other. So love is lust, basically. Superficial, just by looking on the beauty of the other sex. And when they're talking about that inborn suffering in the person who's in love, it's always the man. It's always the knight. Love is derived from the word, love, amor, is derived from the word hook, amar, which signifies capture or be captured. For he who loves is caught in the chains of desire and wishes to catch another with his hook. And the effect of love is that the lover is ennobled. And again, it's the male lover who's ennobled. Love makes an ugly and rude person shine with all beauty, knows how to endow with nobility even one of humble birth, can even lend humility to the proud. So it basically just makes the knight lover a better person. Courtly love in the 12th and 13th centuries was a literary phenomenon and perhaps played as a verbal game in courts in what we now call France. So Andreas Capellanus also includes these dialogues that tell men how to seduce women of different ranks, what they're supposed to say, to win them over with their words. And one of the things that distinguishes this style of love, believe it or not, is not only the theme of suffering, but also the conviction that this sort of love is admirable. Now we're talking about a love at first sight thing, which is lust, and we're also talking with Andreas Capellanus about adulterous love. Capellanus even says that this kind of love can't happen in marriage. So that's really weird. But this love is not only virtuous in itself, but is the very source and cause of all the other virtues. That indeed one cannot be virtuous unless he is a lover. Now this goes everything we think of as being what the Middle Ages was all about, right? Middle Ages was concerned about virtue and sin, and lust was a sin, but no, courtly love, no. You have to, being a lover makes you virtuous, and you can't be virtuous unless you're an adulterous lover. So Chrétien uses the conventions and rules of courtly love, but he doesn't accept that courtly love is noble, ennobling, or even good. So in Yvain, courtly love, a lot of it seems to be lifted right out of Andreas Capellanus' tract, but it makes Yvain look stupid. It makes him a prisoner. And it certainly doesn't make Yvain more noble. After he falls in love with this lady, he sees her and falls in love with her right away. Or seems to. Yvain has followed this knight that he's defeated and wounded into his castle, and Yvain has sacrificed his horse to get in that castle. He goes through underneath the portcullis even though he knows he's not going to quite make it, and his horse gets chopped off. But he's got to go because he needs evidence, because otherwise Kay will tease him. At 1339, the narrator says that Yvain is perturbed to see them burying the corpse when he can get nothing as evidence that he overcame and slew him. So the knight, who is Ascletos the Red, the knight of the spring in the castle, is wounded and dies, and all Yvain cares about is getting evidence so that people would believe that he won. And in that same section, in that same paragraph, the story moves right from his wanting evidence so he's not mocked to newfound love with his sugar and honeycomb has brought him fresh sweetness. Having hunted through his lands and fastened on his prey, it is love that is hunted, and Yvain is his prey. And Yvain's heart is carried away by her who is his enemy. So his enemy is the knight of the castle's wife, whom Yvain has fallen in love with. So the love is described as attacking him gently through his eyes, striking them through to the heart. So that's right out of this same idea as in The Art of Courtly Love. And love is described as a wound. So he's been wounded by love. And so love makes Yvain look stupid and selfish, and it makes him a prisoner also to his love, to love in general, that should be a capital L, and to his wife. The wife's, he eventually ends up marrying Laudine, the woman of the castle. So I guess I should say here that he's a prisoner to his lover, his female lover. And the damsel who rescues him, who is also a servant of Laudine, the lady of the castle, tells Yvain that Laudine wishes to keep you imprisoned and to have you have such complete possession of your person that not even your heart will be at liberty. So he's described as being enthralled to her, that she owns him. And he's told to behave humbly so that she doesn't make his imprisonment hard on him, and he's fine with that. And then the narrator says, anyone who loves is truly in prison. But the next thing that the narrator makes him do, or Chrétien makes him do, so around line 1972, is fall to his knees and say like a true lover, indeed, my lady, I shall not implore your mercy, but rather thank you for whatever you wish to do with me, for nothing could cause me displeasure. What happened to all his quest? He doesn't care anymore. And he's completely enthralled to her, and that's fine with him. He looks like an idiot. So courtly love doesn't make him noble at all, and it also like doesn't work. I mean, doesn't seem to be sincere. In spite of his saying that he'll do anything she asks, and in spite of the narrator saying, my lord Yvain parted from the lady so very unwillingly that his heart stays behind, he forgets about his wife. He forgets about his wife and his responsibility to guard the fountain. So it says around 2639, my lord Yvain parted from the lady so very unwillingly that his heart stayed behind. The king can lead away his body, the king Gawain, but will take no part of his heart, which clings so closely to the heart of the one who is left behind that he is powerless to take it with him. Well, this ends up being complete nonsense, because the year passes and he doesn't go home. And what happens next is Laudin's messenger, a damsel, shows up where Yvain is partying with Gawain and Arthur, and calls him out and says, "You're a disloyal traitor, a liar and deceiver." And he's about to cry, but he's ashamed, and so courtly love isn't even working. It's another way that Chrétien is making fun of it. Lancelot, or the Knight of the Cart, also uses the conventions and tropes of courtly love. Now, this is interesting in that Chrétien's patron for this romance is a woman, Marie de Champagne. She's a countess, and Chrétien wrote something else for her husband. Can't remember which one. But Chrétien uses courtly love here, and he also uses some of the conventions that he uses in Yvain. So, for one thing, King Arthur looks stupid again. You'll see that when you read the romance. And Lancelot has foils again, but this time they're Kay and Gawain. Kay is the loser in this romance. He goes out and gets walloped and kidnapped. And Gawain is figured as the pragmatic and prudent knight, while Lancelot is motivated by love, and the narrator takes some time out to contrast love with reason. The question here, though, is, knowing that courtly love is supposed to ennoble the lover, does Lancelot's love for Guinevere ennoble him or not? Is Lancelot heroic, to be admired, a savior? Or is Chrétien speaking out of both sides of his mouth? I think it's the latter, but you could argue either, I think. It's possible, I think, that on the surface Chrétien is saying one thing, but he is hinting at the opposite. And there's a point in the romance that that will, if you haven't, that will make you reevaluate some of Lancelot's motivations, and well, actually his motivation is always love, but make you reevaluate his heroism and what love does for him. Another interesting question in this romance is, what are all these women doing there? Right off, you go from one damsel to another. There are 5 of them. They're not named, and so I've kept track of them for you. And it turns out that number 2 and number 5 are the same. But unlike Yvain, Lancelot has a whole lot to do with women. Another interesting and intriguing thing for me is that most scholars think that Chrétien stops writing when Lancelot is locked in a tower, and that the romance is finished by someone else. And it seems to me that Chrétien has painted himself into a corner here, and he just isn't as invested in this romance as he is in Yvain or Eric in a Need, or especially Percival. But again, this is a romance where the protagonist doesn't develop. There's no development in Lancelot. He doesn't change at all. He's there showing us something. And I think, I might have said this already, but I think the only knightly protagonist who actually develops, changes by developing, is Percival, in the Romance of Percival, or the Quest for the Grail. So a lot of the literature in the Middle Ages was didactic, which means that it was meant to teach its listeners something. And oftentimes when we think of the Middle Ages, we think of it as being totally spiritual and religious, and worried about their life in eternity, and confessing your sin, and worried about whether you're going to heaven and hell, or hell. That life in the hereafter was what was important. That's what scholars used to always say. And that's at least was the stereotypical attitude towards the Middle Ages. That people thought, it's all about sin. But, that's not true. There are a lot of religious writings that concern themselves with the soul and with sin. But medieval epic and romance, not so much. There is a romance that we're not going to read this semester about Gawain that actually has something to say about sin. And Sir Gawain and the Green Knight can be said to address itself to issues of sin. But these early romances, like especially Chrétien's, no, not especially Chrétien's, but these early romances aren't concerned with sin. Now, maybe Lancelot's an exception, but Chrétien's romances aim to teach, but he cares more about proper ethical behavior and about knights living up to a code, and how a good knight is supposed to act. Now, his code is influenced by Christian precepts. For example, in Yvain, he contrasts the selfishness of Yvain's early exploits with his more Christian approach when he's not mad anymore, because he saves people and stuff. Chrétien doesn't talk about the 7 deadly sins, nor does he talk overtly about the afterlife and the state of the soul. And in fact, even his story of Percival, while it mentions the Grail, it's not a holy Grail. Chrétien is the first one that we know of to insert the stuff about the Grail that sends knights out on quests. But it's not a holy Grail. It's just something that initiates some adventures. It might have changed by the end of the story, but he didn't finish that romance, so we don't know for sure. So one of the things we're looking for in these romances is what does Chrétien have to say about the values that this noble class, this knightly class, should have.